Take the chisel of awareness.
This is episode 8, Broad Context. Welcome back. In the previous episode, we explored the third dimension of seeing, external and internal objects. We discovered that our experience is shaped not only by what appears in the world around us, but also by what appears within us. A person's words, a broken vase, the sound of a voice, these are external objects we can easily relate to. Then, almost immediately, something else appears. A thought, an emotion, a memory, a sensation, an expectation. These are internal objects. We saw that an external event can become a triggering object, setting in motion an unfolding of internal objects that may continue long after the original event has passed. That is a profound shift. But it also raises another question. Suppose I recognize the external object. Suppose I recognize the thoughts, emotions, and memories that arise within me. Is that enough to see reality completely? Consider a simple example. A parent walks into a room and finds a broken vase on the floor. The broken vase is an external object. Thoughts immediately arise. My child was careless. Frustration follows. Perhaps disappointment, perhaps anger. The parent recognizes all of these as part of the unfolding of experience. But what if the child had been trying to protect a younger sibling? What if someone else had accidentally knocked the vase over? What if the vase had already been cracked? None of these possibilities are visible in the broken vase itself. They belong to something larger, the context in which the event occurred. Recognizing the objects that appear in our experience is essential, but by itself, it does not tell us whether we are seeing the whole situation. Every object exists within a broader context, a context of history, of circumstances, of relationships maybe, of intentions, of responsibilities, consequences, and countless other factors that are not immediately visible. Without that wider context, the mind can easily mistake one fragment for the whole. Today, we explore the fourth dimension of seeing, broad context, because perhaps seeing reality is not only about recognizing the objects that appear before us and within us. Perhaps it is also about seeing the larger context that gives those objects their meaning. Let's begin. Let's get into this episode through a small story. John is presenting an idea during a meeting. He has spent several days preparing. As he explains his proposal, he notices people listening carefully. Halfway through a sentence, his manager suddenly interrupts. John, we'll need to move on. We only have a few minutes left. John stops speaking. A thought immediately appears. He always interrupts me. Another thought quickly follows. He doesn't value what I have to say. The meeting continues, but John is no longer fully present. He hears the discussion, but his attention remains on the interruption. He replays the moment again and again. The tone, the timing, the words. By the end of the meeting, he feels frustrated and slightly resentful. Later that afternoon, another colleague walks into his office. You know why Sarah interrupted you, don't you? John shakes his head, indicating he didn't know. The client arrived early. She had just received a message asking everyone to finish within 2 minutes. John pauses. He thinks back to the meeting. Nothing about the interruption has changed. The words is exactly the same. The tone is exactly the same. The event is exactly the same. Yet somehow everything feels different now. What changed? The interruption did not change. John's understanding of it changed. And that raises an important question. How often do we react not to the whole situation, but to only a small part we can immediately see? Today, we are going to explore another dimension of seeing, broad context. So now let's move into the next section, which is about what is broad context. Imagine you are walking through a park one afternoon. As you pass a bench, you notice a man speaking sharply to a young child. His voice is raised. The child looks down at the ground. For a moment, you feel uncomfortable. A thought immediately appears. What an impatient father. The scene lasts only a few seconds before you continue walking. Later, you learn something unexpected. The child had run into the road only moments earlier. A speeding cyclist had narrowly avoided hitting them. The father was not shouting out of anger. He was still shaken by what had almost happened. Nothing about the scene has changed. The father's words are the same. The child's expression is the same. The raised voice is the same. Yet everything feels different. So really, what changed? The event did not change. The context did. This is the essence of broad context. Every event we encounter exists within something much larger than the small fragment we immediately observe. There is always a history. There are circumstances we may not know. There are relationships that have been unfolding for years. There are intentions hidden beneath actions. There are pressures, responsibilities, fears, hopes, and experiences that remain invisible to us. Most of the time, we do not see these things. We see only the small window that happens to be in front of us. The mind naturally treats that window as though it were the whole picture. It quietly fills in the missing pieces. It creates a story. And before long, we find ourselves reacting, not to the whole reality, but to the small part we happen to witness. Broad context invites us to remember something simple. The fragment is real, but it is rarely the whole. Seeing broad context does not mean imagining endless possibilities or refusing to reach conclusions. It means recognizing that our first view is often incomplete. It invites us to remain curious a little longer, to ask what else might belong to the situation that I have not yet seen. That simple question widens perception, and when perception widens, understanding often follows. So now let's reflect on this section on what is a broad context. Think of a situation where your first impression of someone later turned out to be incomplete. What small fragment did you see? What larger context did you discover later? Now consider the situations you are experiencing today. How many of them might still be missing pieces you have not yet seen? Sometimes the most important part of reality is not what is immediately visible, but what quietly surrounds it. The single takeaway for this section on what is an object is that broad context reminds us that every event is part of a larger reality. The more that reality we are able to see, the less likely we are to mistake a fragment for the whole. The next section is on how the mind naturally sees through a narrow context. One of the most remarkable abilities of the human mind is its capacity to make sense of the world. Every day we encounter thousands of sights, sounds, words, and events. If we had to consciously analyze every one of them, life would become overwhelming. So the mind does something extraordinary. It quickly organizes experience, looks for patterns, and gives meaning to what it encounters. Most of the time, this serves us well. But there is also a hidden weakness in the way the mind works. The mind often reaches a conclusion before it has seen the whole picture. Imagine someone walks past you without saying hello. Almost instantly a thought appears, they are ignoring me. Or perhaps they must be upset with me. Notice how quickly the mind moved. It didn't simply observe that someone walked past. It added a meaning. Or imagine receiving a short email. Please see me when you have a moment. Within seconds, the mind may begin imagining criticism, disappointment, or even bad news. Yet nothing in the mail actually said any of those things. The mind has taken a small fragment and quietly completed the story. This happens constantly. A facial expression, a tone of voice, a delayed reply, a mistake, a single sentence. The mind takes one small piece of reality and treats it as though it were the whole. This is what we mean by a narrow context. A narrow context is not seeing something that isn't there. It is seeing too little and believing it is everything. From that narrow view, thought begins to build. An interpretation appears. The interpretation becomes a story. The story feels true. And before long, we react, not to reality itself, but to the story the mind has created. This does not mean the mind is faulty. It is doing what it has always done. It fills gaps. It seeks certainty. It prefers a quick explanation to an incomplete picture. The difficulty is not that the mind reaches conclusions. The difficulty is that it often reaches them too soon. Broad context begins with a simple recognition. The fragment we first see is rarely the whole. There is almost always more to the situation than our first impression reveals. And the moment we recognize that possibility, something begins to change. The mind becomes a little less certain, a little more curious, a little more willing to wait before deciding what reality means. The small shift is the beginning of broad context. Now let us reflect on the section of the mind naturally seeing through a narrow context. Think about the last time you reached a quick conclusion about someone or something. What was the fragment you saw? What parts of the situation were still invisible to you? What did you discover later that changed your understanding? Perhaps the first impression wasn't wrong, but was it complete? And the single takeaway from this section about the mind naturally seeing through a small context is that the mind naturally fills in what it cannot see. Broad context begins when we recognize that our first impression is rarely the whole picture. So now we're entering the next section, which is about the story the mind creates. The human mind is remarkably good at making sense of the world. Every day we encounter incomplete information, we overhear part of a conversation, we notice a facial expression, we receive a short message, we witness in a single moment in someone's day. Rarely do we see the entire picture. Yet the mind is uncomfortable leaving the picture unfinished. Imagine watching the first half of a movie before someone suddenly turns off the television. Almost immediately you begin imagining how the story might end, not because you know, but because the mind naturally seeks completion. The same movement takes place throughout every day of our lives. A colleague walks past you without saying hello. The event is simple. Someone walked past, but the mind rarely leaves it there. They're upset with me. They're ignoring me. I must have done something wrong. Or imagine receiving a message from a friend. Can we talk? Nothing more. Within seconds, the mind begins writing the rest of the conversation. Something must be wrong. They are disappointed in me. I've upset them. Notice what has happened. The event was incomplete. The mind quietly completed it. This is one of the reasons broad context is so important. Where the larger context is missing, thought naturally fills the empty spaces with a story. The story is often reasonable. Sometimes it is even correct. But it remains a story until reality reveals more of itself. The difficulty is not that stories appear. The difficulty is that they quickly begin to feel like reality. Once that happens, we stop looking. Curiosity comes to an end. The mind quietly says, I know what happened. Broad context generally interrupts this certainty. It reminds us that the first story is rarely the only story. There may be circumstances we do not yet know. There may be intentions we have not yet discovered. There may be pressures, relationships, or events that remain outside our view. The wider the context becomes, the less tightly we cling to the first explanation that enters the mind. Something subtle begins to change. Instead of asking, why did they do that? We begin asking, what else might be true? That question keeps the field of perception open. It allows reality to reveal itself before the mind settles on a conclusion. So now let's reflect on this section on the mind creating a story. Think of a situation where your first explanation of an event later turned out to be incomplete. What story did your mind create? How certain did it feel at that time? What new information changed your understanding? Now ask yourself one more question. How many stories am I carrying today that may simply be waiting for more context? The next section is a very interesting section. It is about a metaphor for the broad context. It's called the cracked cup. It'll make sense by the time you get to the end of this section. Imagine holding a simple ceramic cup in your hands. It feels solid, useful, reliable. At first glance, it seems complete. Then you notice something. Running along one side is a small crack. The cup still holds water. It is still useful, but the crack quietly reminds you of something. The cup is not guaranteed to remain exactly as it is. It may last for many years, or it may slip from your hands tomorrow. The crack is not there to make you anxious. It is there to remind you that certainty is an illusion. But the cup reveals something else. The cup is a container. It holds whatever is placed within it. In the same way, every situation we enter is a container of possibilities. Before a meeting begins, many outcomes are possible. Before a conversation starts, many responses are possible. Before you leave home for work, many journeys are possible. Reality has not yet unfolded. The cup contains all these possibilities. The difficulty is that our minds rarely enter the situation carrying the whole cup. Instead, they carry only one expectation. The meeting will go well. Traffic will be light. Everyone will understand what I mean. People will behave reasonably. The mind quietly selects one possibility and begins treating it as though it were the future. When reality unfolds differently, surprise quickly becomes frustration. Frustration becomes reaction. Reaction then becomes suffering, not because reality was wrong, but because our expectation had become too narrow. The cracked cup reminds us to hold more than one possibility before life unfolds. Suppose you are about to drive across town. Before turning the key, you quietly acknowledge that many things may happen. Somehow, someone may cut in front of you. Traffic may come to a standstill. A road may be closed. You may miss a turn. Someone may misunderstand your driving. Or perhaps, on a positive note, the journey will be smooth. All these possibilities already exist. None of them has yet become reality. Yet you're not predicting the future. You're simply recognizing that the future has not yet chosen one path. Now imagine that another driver suddenly cuts you off. Without the cracked cup, the mind immediately says, this shouldn't have happened. The expectation has been violated. The reaction grows. With the cracked cup, something is different. Being cut off has already been one of the possibilities you had quietly accepted before beginning the journey. The event is still unpleasant. You still respond appropriately, but the mind is less shocked, less offended, less likely to become a story around what has happened. The same principle applies everywhere. Before an important conversation, someone may agree, someone may disagree, someone may misunderstand you. You may misunderstand them. Before presenting an idea, people may appreciate it. They may criticize it. They may ask difficult questions. Before meeting a friend, they may be cheerful. They may be distracted. They may be carrying burdens you cannot see. The purpose is not to imagine every possible outcome. The purpose is to loosen the mind's attachment to a single outcome. As the range of possibilities widen, expectation becomes gentler. The mind no longer has complete freedom to insist that reality should have unfolded only this way. Something else begins to emerge: openness, curiosity, a willingness to meet whatever reality presents. Then there is the handle. The handle reminds us that while we cannot choose which possibility life presents, we can choose how we meet it. We cannot control the unfolding of reality, but we can hold ourselves with openness rather than certainty. Perhaps that is the real purpose of the cracked cup, not to prepare us for disappointment, but to prepare us for reality. So now let us reflect on this interesting section on the cracked cup. Before beginning an activity tomorrow, pause for just a moment. It might be your commute, a meeting, dinner with your family, or a conversation with a friend. Ask yourself, what are 2 or 3 different ways this situation might unfold? Notice what happens. Does your expectation become a little softer? Does your mind become a little more open? Then when reality unfolds, ask another question. How much inconvenience came from the event itself? And how much came from expecting something different? Now let us look at the single takeaway from this section on the cracked cup. The cracked cup reminds us that every situation contains many possibilities. As we loosen our attachment to a single expectation, we meet reality with greater openness, and the mind becomes less reactive when life unfolds differently than imagined. This section is also another very interesting section. It is to do with the ripples created by our action. Broad context is not only about understanding what is happening now, it is also about seeing what our actions are likely to create. Imagine standing beside a still lake. You gently drop a small stone into the water. The stone disappears almost immediately, but something else continues. Small ripples begin spreading across the surface. Each ripple reaches further than the one before it. Although the stone is gone, its effect continues. Our actions are often like that. A word spoken in anger, a thoughtful question, a patient response, a harsh criticism. Each one creates ripples that extend beyond the moment in which they were spoken. The difficulty is that the mind often sees only the stone. Broad context invites us to see the ripples. Imagine John sitting in a meeting. As the team reviews a report, he notices an error made by Mark. Immediately a thought appears, this is careless. The mistake is obvious. The correction is necessary. The reactive mind reaches a quick conclusion. I'll point it out now. From a narrow context, the situation seems simple. There is a mistake, someone made it, correct it, move on. But broad context asks another question. What happens next? If John corrects Mark publicly, the error may indeed be fixed, but what else may happen? Will Mark become more willing to learn? Or will he become anxious about speaking in future meetings? Will the rest of the team become more open about mistakes or more careful to hide them? Will trust deepen or quietly weaken? Suddenly, the situation is no longer just about an error. It is about learning. It is about relationships, about trust, the culture of the team, the future. John decides to wait. After the meeting, he speaks privately with Mark. The mistake is corrected. Mark understands what went wrong. Nothing about the truth has been compromised. And Mark is also very glad that this was not revealed in public. But something valuable has also been preserved. Mark leaves the conversation encouraged rather than humiliated. The relationship remains strong. The team continues to feel safe admitting mistakes. Broad context did not prevent correction. It simply widened John's perception before he acted. This principle extends far beyond the workplace. A parent corrects a child, a husband responds to a wife, a stranger reacts in traffic, a manager gives feedback, a friend disagrees. Every response creates ripples. Some ripples strengthen relationships, others quietly weaken them. Most of the time, we notice only the immediate result. Broad context encourages us to notice what may continue long after the moment has passed. This does not mean we become passive. It does not mean we avoid difficult conversations. Sometimes firm action is exactly what the situation requires. Broad context is not asking us to become less truthful. It is asking us to become more complete in our seeing. Before speaking, it quietly asks, what is this response likely to produce? Not simply today, but tomorrow, next week, perhaps even years from now. When we begin seeing the ripples, our actions naturally become more thoughtful. Not because someone has given us a moral rule, but because we have begun seeing more of reality. Now let us reflect on this section, which is a very interesting one about seeing the ripples of our action. Think about a conversation that has stayed with you for years. Perhaps it lasted only a few minutes. Why has it remained with you? What ripples did it create? Now think about something you said recently. Before speaking, did you see only the stone? Or did you see the ripples your words might create? Perhaps broad context invites us to ask one simple question before we act. What is likely to grow from what I am about to do? Now let us look at the single takeaway from this section on seeing the ripples of our action. Broad context allows us to see beyond the immediate moment. It reminds us that every action creates ripples, and clearer seeing includes not only the present event, but the future it is likely to shape. The next section is about the widening of the context. Broad context is not something that appears all at once. It develops gradually. At first, the mind sees only what is immediately in front of it. A criticism feels like an attack. A delayed reply feels like rejection. An interruption feels like disrespect. The event fills the entire field of perception. Nothing else seems to exist. As we begin practicing broad context, something subtle changes. The event is still seen, the emotion is still felt, but another question quietly appears. What else might be true? The single question begins to widen the field. Instead of seeing only the criticism, we begin to notice the circumstances surrounding it. Instead of seeing only the interruption, we begin to notice the pressures affecting the other person. Instead of seeing only the mistake, we begin to notice the human being who made it. The event has not changed. The field has. At first, this widening may happen only occasionally, perhaps hours after the event. You suddenly realize, maybe I misunderstood. Later, the widening happens sooner. Perhaps while you are still upset, another possibility enters your mind. I wonder if something else is going on. Over time, the widening becomes more natural. The mind becomes less eager to reach immediate conclusions. It becomes more comfortable remaining with uncertainty. Not because uncertainty is pleasant, but because experience has shown that reality is often larger than first appearances. Something else begins to change as well. The people around us begin to look different. The impatient colleague becomes someone under pressure. The defensive friend becomes someone protecting an insecurity. The angry stranger becomes someone carrying a burden we cannot see, or at least at that moment. This does not mean we excuse harmful behavior. It means we no longer reduce a human being to a single moment. Broad context restores proportion. It reminds us that every person has a history. Every person carries hopes, disappointments, fears, habits, strengths, and weaknesses. Most of these remain invisible to us. The more our context widens, the less our reactions are driven by isolated moments. Understanding begins replacing certainty. Curiosity begins replacing judgment. And something else quietly emerges: compassion. Not as an effort, not as an ideal, but as a natural consequence of seeing more completely. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful aspects of broad context. It does not ask us to become more compassionate, it asks us to see more. And when we truly see more, compassion often arrives on its own. Broad context also has an interesting quality. Each time we widen our understanding in one situation, it becomes little easier to widen it in the next. Like a light spreading through a dark room, each moment of clearer seeing eliminates the moments that follow. The mind becomes less certain, less reactive, less confined to a single interpretation, not because it has become weaker, but because it has become wider. Perhaps this is what psychological growth really looks like. Not accumulating more knowledge, not becoming someone different, but allowing perception itself to become more complete. Now let us reflect on this section about the widening of context. Think back over the past few years. Can you remember situations that once seemed obvious but now look very different? What changed? Did the past change, or did your context become wider? Now ask yourself another question. What situations in your life today might one day look different because your understanding has grown? Perhaps the journey towards seeing reality is simply the gradual widening of context. Now, what is the single takeaway from this section on widening of the context? Broad context develops gradually. As perception widens, certainty softens. Understanding, of course, deepens, and compassion begins to arise. Not because we force it, but because we are finally seeing more of reality. So now we have reached the conclusion of this episode. Let's return to where we began. John was interrupted during a meeting. The interruption was real. His irritation was real. His interpretation was also real. But it wasn't the whole reality. Later, when he learned that the meeting had to end because the client had arrived early, nothing about the event changed. The interruption was the same. The words were the same. The people were the same. Only one thing changed, the context. And with that wider context, John's entire understanding changed. This is why broad context is such an essential dimension of seeing reality. Life rarely presents itself as a complete picture. Instead, it offers us fragments, a word, a glance, a silence, a mistake, a headline, a memory, a feeling. The mind naturally tries to complete the picture. Sometimes it completes it wisely. Sometimes it completes it too quickly. Broad context invites us to pause before accepting the first picture the mind creates. It reminds us that there is almost always more than we can immediately see, more history, more circumstances, more possibilities, and of course, more humanity. The wider the field becomes, the smaller our certainty becomes. And strangely enough, that is not a weakness. It is the beginning of wisdom. Because certainty often closes perception. Curiosity keeps it open. Perhaps this is why broad context changes us so profoundly. It doesn't merely help us understand situations better, it changes the way we meet life itself. We become less eager to judge, less certain that our first impression is complete, more willing to ask, what else might I not be seeing? That simple question has the power to change a conversation, a relationship, a difficult moment, perhaps even a life. The goal is not to see everything. That is practically impossible. The goal is to remember that we never see everything. When we remember that our minds become a little less rigid, our reaction becomes a little less automatic, and reality has a little more room to reveal itself. Perhaps seeing reality is not about becoming someone who always has the right answers. Perhaps it is about becoming someone who is willing to keep the field open a little longer before deciding what reality means. So now let us reflect on this whole episode. As you move through the coming week, notice the moments where your mind quickly reaches a conclusion. Before believing the first story, pause and ask yourself, am I seeing the whole or only a fragment? Then ask one more question. What else might belong in this field that I have not yet seen? You may not find the answer immediately, but the question itself begins to widen perception. And sometimes that is enough for reality to reveal a little more of itself. Now let us look at the takeaway from this episode. Broad context reminds us that reality always is larger than our first impression. The wider the field we see, the less likely we are to mistake a fragment for the whole, a story for reality, or a moment for an entire human being. So what is the next dimension we are going to move to? That dimension is direct perception. Throughout this episode, we have discovered that every event exists within a broader context. A broken vase is not just a broken vase. A disagreement is not just a disagreement. A decision is not just a decision. Every situation is connected to people, histories, intentions, circumstances, and countless influences that are not immediately visible. Seeing that wider context allows us to move beyond isolated fragments and begin understanding the whole. But even this raises another question. Suppose I understand the broader context. Suppose I understand the circumstances. Suppose I appreciate the intentions involved. How much of what I believe actually comes from my own direct experience? Consider the broken vase once more. You walk into a room and see it lying on the floor. You understand that there may be possible explanations, but one question still remains. Did you actually see the vase break? Or are you beginning with what you saw afterwards and building the rest through interpretation? This question reaches far beyond a broken vase. How often do we believe we know what happened? When in reality we only witness part of the event? How often do we confuse what we directly perceived with what we later concluded? The distinction is subtle, yet it quietly shapes much of our experience. In our next episode, we explore another dimension of seeing, direct perception. Because perhaps reality is not only about recognizing broader context, perhaps it is also about recognizing the difference between what we have directly perceived and everything that has been added afterwards. Before we close, I would like to leave you with a simple image. Imagine a soft pillow in the shape of the earth, a soft earth, and imagine yourself holding it gently, hugging it, giving it all the love you can. Because this earth includes all of us, humanity, animals, plants, the environment, everything living together on this small planet. Perhaps from time to time we can return to this image, a soft earth held with care. If you found something meaningful in this episode, please tell others about it. This is first steps to seeing reality, and perhaps the first step is simply to begin noticing. Thank you for listening.
Take the chisel away.